With Gong Yixiao's guidance, the three quickly broke through the Huanghua Palace's protective array and pinpointed their location. The original novel had not described the place where the sun moon dew mushroom grew in much detail, just briefly mentioned that it was, quote, in a stone cave covered by dense greenery, unquote. Merely recalling the sliver of content had costed Shang Qinghua half his soul. In his defense, this mushroom wasn't reserved for Luo Binghe. Rather, it was supposed to be for one of his opponents. It was precisely because of this that Shen Qinqiu dared to seek it for himself. If it were a thing that affected the main plot line, or if it were some mystical flower or herb meant to provide one of Luo Binghe's power-ups, he wouldn't have had the guts to try and steal it. Well, trying to snitch resources from the male lead didn't lead to the kind of sweet and forgiving conclusion you got when you lost a handful of rice for trying to swipe a chicken. But since they were both villains, he figured it should be fine if they reappropriated it. Fortunately, though Bailu Forest was large, there was only one stone cave. This saved them quite a bit of trouble. Shen Qinqiu snapped his fingers, and a bright yellow flame sprung to life at his fingertips. With a flick, the flame swam off into the depths of the damp, pitch-dark cave, a bright tail leisurely swishing behind it to illuminate the path before them. At first, the stone path was wide enough for three people to walk shoulder to shoulder, but the further they went, the narrower it became, until they had to turn sideways to get through. It twisted this way and that, like the coiled intestines of some giant beast. The lighting was poor. Even Shen Qinqiu's ball of flame flickered between bright and dim. He flicked out a few more, and the balls of fire chased each other around. Gong Yixiao took up the rear. Shang Qinghua had wanted to wait outside the cave, but Shen Qinqiu had dragged him in. Maybe he was scared or something, because he touched Shen Qinqiu's arm from time to time, making goosebumps run down it whenever he did. Finally, Shen Qinqiu couldn't take it anymore. Because they were with an interloper, he lowered his voice to hiss, "Can you stop pinching me?" There was no reply, but at least the touches stopped. Shen Qinqiu continued to grope his way forward, but Shang Qinghua suddenly kicked him in the calf. Shen Qinqiu couldn't help but let out a fuck slip from his mouth. Shang Qinghua's voice sounded from far behind. "Shen, Marshal, brother, what did you say?" His voice echoed through the winding corridors like he had been stretched by the distance. It seemed that Shen Qinqiu had been unconsciously walking faster and faster, while Shang Qinghua had dawdled, meaning Gong Yixiao, who was taking up the rear, was unable to pick up the pace. He had already left the other two quite a ways behind. But if Shang Qinghua hadn't been touching his arm, then who had? Or, in other words, what had been touching his arm? Shen Qinqiu ground to a halt. With a blank expression on his face, he patted his arm, attempting to brush off the goosebumps. A few balls of flame were still suspended in mid-air, burning faintly. "The enemy's in the dark. I'm in the light," he thought. With a flick of his left hand, Shen Qinqiu silently produced 2 paper talismans from his sleeve, while his right hand slowly drew Xiuya's sword. The sword grew increasingly bright, but the only thing in front and behind him was dark stone, which gave off a damp, rank odor. Then Shen Qinqiu realized that, when something had collided with his calf a second before, it hadn't felt like a kick from a foot. Rather, it had been more like a headbutt. Shen Qinqiu jerked his head down, and his gaze met that of a deathly pale and bloated face on the ground. Shen Qinqiu threw his talismans at the face, and in an instant, the narrow stone pathway lit up with bursts of fire and flashes of lightning. He wanted to draw his sword, but he hadn't realized that the space was too narrow. Before he'd even drawn it halfway out of its sheath, his right arm knocked against the wall of the tunnel, and the hilt of his sword hit the stone with a clang. The thing on the ground was soft and boneless, slithering back and forth like a giant snake. It was more agile than Shen Qingqiu, and it evaded his attacks so quickly that even at this point-blank range, the talismans failed to hit it. In a short time, Shen Qingqiu had lost attempting to draw his sword. It had already reversed course with a swish and slithered away, heading right in the direction of Shang Qinghua and Gong Yixiao. "Watch out!" he yelled. "There's something heading your way!" At this time, Shang Qinghua immediately turned around and yelled, "Young hero, quick! Let's switch places!" He worked in logistics. How could he be the front line of an assault? Gong Yixiao tried to do as instructed, but the pathway was already narrow enough to raise the hair on one's nape. There was only enough space for one person to walk with a fist's width of a margin besides. He couldn't get around at all. Shen Qingqiu yelled again, "On the ground! Look on the ground! It's crawling on the ground!" When Shang Qinghua turned his head back, he saw a snake man slithering toward them. He made a swift decision and collapsed on the spot. Gong Yixiao had never seen such an eerie monster either, and he froze for a moment. But upon seeing Shang Qinghua's sudden collapse, his face twitched. "My apologies," he cried as he leapt over Shang Qinghua. Though it was done in an unsightly way, the logistics guy and the vanguard finally at least managed to switch places. "Don't draw your sword," Shen Qingqiu yelled again. Before he could finish the word sword, Gong Yixiao had carelessly tried to draw. Of course, he ended up suffering the same disastrous consequence. His hilt hit the stone wall before the sword was halfway out. Shen Qingqiu finally arrived, holding his own blade. "Ah, idiot!" he blurted out. Gong Yixiao was rather aggrieved. In truth, Shen Qingqiu also knew that the issue was that the boy's reflexes were too fast, leading him to move before he finished listening. Anyone else would have done the same, but in the past, on the few occasions Shen Qingqiu had partnered with Luo Binghe, his disciple had understood exactly what Shen Qingqiu wanted, and he had always responded perfectly without his master needing to offer a single word of clarification. The contrast was as clear as day. Shen Qingqiu couldn't help but miss the benefits and ease working with Luo Binghe had afforded him. The stone corridor meandered back and forth, and moreover, it was dark, which made for an extremely advantageous environment for that thing to move through. Shen Qingqiu drew out another handful of talismans, but the thing had already slithered away and disappeared. "Senior Shen, that snake, was that the demonic creature you encountered in Bailu Forest?" Gong Yixiao asked in disbelief. "It was," said Shen Qingqiu. "I still don't understand how that thing managed to escape our pincer attack." "By squeezing past me." Expression unchanging, Shang Qinghua got up from the ground and patted the dust from his robes. Gong Yixiao pointedly said nothing. Let's go," said Shen Qingqiu. "This time, stay close to me." His reminder wasn't necessary. This time, even on the threat of death, Shang Qinghua refused to stray more than an arm's length away from him. After a dizzying number of twists and turns, the three finally made their way out of the stone corridor. Deep in the belly of the cave, they suddenly came upon a deep cavern. Before, Shen Qingqiu hadn't really understood how anything called the sun-moon-dew mushroom could be found in the depths of a cave, which presumably had neither sunlight nor moonlight. The name clearly indicated a thing that gathered spiritual energy from nature, and from the essence of sun and moon. So how could it grow in this place? Now he finally got it. As it turned out, at the cavern's highest point, a giant opening in the ceiling yawned up towards the sky. Sun and moonlight fell through this opening like a spotlight to hit a single point at the heart of an underground lake. A little mound of soil surrounded by glittering water was naturally a hallowed location with excellent feng shui, and it was where the sun moon dew mushroom grew. "The Dew Lake," Shan Qinghua said with conviction. "Ha! I'm certain." Having received confirmation, Shen Qinqiu let out a sigh of relief. They had found the right place. The lake before them was filled with no ordinary water, but rather with unsullied morning dew. This unsullied water collected from morning dew, brimming with spiritual energy, and nourished the sun moon dew mushroom. After the mushrooms matured, their fungal roots sank into the water and soil to nourish the dew water in return. In this way, the spiritual energy cycled back and forth and diminished, never to be exhausted. Admiring the beautiful scene, Gong Yixiao finally understood the Peak Lord's objective, but he still found it a bit odd. Changqiu Mountain was a major sect that produced mystical herbs and elixirs, and surely they gathered a number of rare and treasured flowers every day. Though this mushroom was scarce and precious, it didn't look like something that could grant immortality, nor a breakthrough to ascension. So, how did it merit 2 Peak Lords personally taking a long journey to collect it? Meanwhile, Shen Qinqiu's eyes were fixed solely on the small white fleshy pods in the center of the lake. With a sweep of his sleeves, he stepped resolutely into the water. After a few dozen steps, the dew water reached his waist, neither warm nor cold, soaking his skin. It felt as if it could soak right through to the heart. Though these mushrooms were small and looked just like bean sprouts, once they were planted somewhere with excellent feng shui and a bounty of spiritual energy, and nurtured according to plan. Shen Qinqiu hesitated at the sight of the dozen or so white mushrooms growing on the little dirt mound, small and tender. Come to think of it, these mushrooms were a natural wonder. To harvest every last one seemed a little bit immoral. But, on second thought, if he didn't pick all of them now, another villain would pick them later, which would be even more immoral. And if they messed up and destroyed one, it would be good to have a few extra as backup, just to be absolutely safe. Insurance was critically important. Having made his decision, he carefully pulled up each mushroom together with a little soil and stored them in his sleeves. When the last mushroom was in his hands, Shen Qinqiu suddenly heard the sound of a sword being drawn behind him before he could properly stow it. When he turned around, Gong Yixiao had his sword in hand, and he was staring straight at Shen Qinqiu. At first, Shen Qinqiu thought Gong Yixiao was protesting his slapdash approach to harvesting, but Shan Qinghua was in the same stance. It was then he knew something had gone wrong, and he held his breath. Suddenly, something long and large leapt out of the surface of the lake, and it looked like a giant fish, and it pounced straight toward Shen Qinqiu. A pale and deadened face flew right at him, and it was that thing that had been following them since they reached the forest. At the same time, Gong Yixiao finished forming his sword seal, and his sword flew at the thing like a bolt of lightning. But once the thing missed Shen Qinqiu, it sank into the lake and did not resurface, stirring the long settled silt at the bottom until the water became turbid and murky. Gong Yixiao recoiled his sword. "Senior Shen, come back to the shore, quick!" But Shen Qinqiu smiled. "Don't panic. I want to go fishing." He stood in place without moving, and he slowly extracted a talisman from his robe. "A single talisman probably isn't," Gong Yixiao started. Before quote enough unquote could leave his mouth, Shen Qinqiu rubbed the talisman like he would rub a bill, and the single talisman abruptly became an entire stack. Holding the stack of talismans, Shen Qinqiu thrust his fist into the water. A chain of booms followed. The surface of the lake exploded, sending up over 12 sprays of water into the air, each several meters tall. This explosion also threw the snake man hiding on the bottom into the air. he was tossed up high before crashing heavily to the ground by Shang Qinghua's feet. Shen Qingqiu dripped his way back to the shore. After being given a meaningful look, Gong Yixiao used the hilt of his sword to turn the creature over. Once it had been, all three were horror-struck.